November 1959. Yuma, Arizona. A pawn shop on Main Street 3 blocks from the Colorado River crossing, where the desert heat stays past what November has any right to, and the sun comes off the sidewalk hard enough to make a man squint at noon. A veteran is standing outside with a rifle he has been trying to sell for 40 minutes and cannot make himself go in. His name was Danny Garrett, and he was 28 years old, and he had been standing on that sidewalk since 11:15. He had come down from the apartment on 3rd Street with the rifle in a canvas case, and he had walked the 6 blocks to the pawn shop, and he had put his hand on the door handle twice and taken it off both times, because a man who carried a rifle through the Chosin Reservoir and brought it home the same way he brought himself home, intact, on his own 2 feet, refusing to leave it behind, does not walk into a pawn shop easily. He had been a corporal in the 1st Marine Division, 7th Regiment, and the Springfield had been his since boot camp at Parris Island in 1949, and he had qualified expert with it at 17 yards and at 500, and he had carried it through the cold that the Chosin Reservoir became in November of 1950, and he had brought it home in the spring of 1951, and had kept it through 8 years of married life and 2 daughters, and a mechanic's job that had been good until the fall of 1959, when the garage cut hours, and now was not. Here is the story. Danny Garrett had come home from Korea in 1951 with a Purple Heart citation and the rifle, and a particular quietness that his wife Carol had learned to read the way you learn to read weather. It had its patterns and its tells, and you knew when to talk and when not to. He had found work as a mechanic in Yuma because Yuma was where Carol's family was, and because Carol's family was what they had for a support structure when the VA support structure was what it was. He was good with engines. He had been good with engines since before the Corps, and the Corps had made him better, and the garage on 16th Street had taken him on and paid him a fair wage, and he had been making the rent and feeding his family and setting aside a small amount each month against emergencies for 8 years. The emergency arrived in September when the garage owner, a man named Bauer, sat all his mechanics down and explained that the business had hit a slow stretch and he was cutting everyone to 3 days a week, effective the following Monday. This was not malice. Bauer was a fair man in a business that had thinned. 3 days a week at Danny's rate was $54 a week, and the rent was $65 a month, and the girls needed food and clothes and diapers for the younger one. And 4 months of the math not working had brought Danny Garrett to a sidewalk on Main Street in Yuma with the Springfield in a canvas case and his hand on the door handle of a pawn shop. The shop had a cardboard sign in the window that said, "Rifles, top dollar." Top dollar on a 1903 Springfield in serviceable condition was $45, and Danny knew it, and the knowledge was part of what was keeping his hand off the door handle. The sun was at its peak, and the sidewalk was hot through his boots, and the desert smell of Yuma in November, dry dust and motor oil, and the faint mineral sharpness of the river 2 miles west, was the same smell it had been on every working day of the 8 years he had spent as a mechanic in this town, which was most of what he had been since the Corps. Danny had grown up in Tucson and had worked on cars since he was 12 and had joined the Marines at 17 because it was 1949, and it was what young men who wanted to prove something did, and the Corps had taken what he was and organized it into something he was proud of in a way he had not been able to articulate to his wife or his daughters or anyone else in the 8 years since. He had a wife who worked 2 days a week at a dress shop on 1st Avenue to supplement the mechanic wages, and he had 2 daughters, Ruth, who was 5, and Celia, who was 2. And he had the rifle on the canvas case, and he had been standing on that sidewalk for 40 minutes. Have you ever known a man who did everything right, served, came home, worked, raised his family, asked nothing from anyone, and still ended up on a sidewalk trying to sell the last thing he would have chosen to sell? Some of you served. Some of you know a man who came home from a war and spent the years after it doing the quiet work of holding a life together, with no fanfare and no help. This story belongs to them. The pawn shop at that hour on a Tuesday in November had the particular stillness of a place that does not expect much business. The owner, a man named Ortiz, who had been running the shop since 1952, had seen Danny outside twice from behind the front window and had not gone out. Because a man who had not made up his mind yet did not need the door opened for him. 3 men who had come in and out of the shop that morning for their own business had passed Danny on the sidewalk, and one of them had nodded, and one of them had looked away. The hardware store 2 doors down had a man sweeping the front walk who had glanced at Danny once and then swept in the other direction. Nobody went to him. Nobody had anything to offer that addressed the arithmetic. The problem was not a locked door or a legal clause or a creditor with a policy. The problem was that a man who had served with the 1st Marine Division at the Chosin Reservoir was standing on a sidewalk in his own country trying to sell the rifle he carried there, because nobody in the apparatus that was supposed to take care of him had done quite enough. You know what that kind of failure looks like. The invisible kind. The kind that happens between the paperwork and the life. Where are you watching from? Drop your state in the comments. I want to see how far this story reaches. The man who saw Danny from across Main Street had been walking from the Army-Navy surplus store, where he had been looking at field equipment for a picture in early development. He was in Yuma because the desert light in November was exactly what the picture needed, and because the Colorado River crossing gave him a geography he could not find elsewhere in the state. He had his hands in his pockets and his hat brimmed down against the noon sun. He was thinking about the picture and not about Main Street when he looked across the street and saw a young man in work clothes standing outside a pawn shop with a canvas rifle case in his hand. He had seen that posture before. Not the rifle case, the posture. The way a man stands when he is trying to make himself do something and cannot quite get there. And the thing he is trying to make himself do is the kind of thing he is only going to do once, and he knows it. He stopped on his side of the street. He looked at the canvas case. He looked at the posture. He looked at the face. He crossed the street. He did not come up fast, and he did not make a production of it. He walked to where Danny was standing, and he stopped a few feet away, close enough to talk, not close enough to crowd. He said, "That a Springfield?" Danny looked at him. He said it was. He said, "Mind if I take a look?" Danny hesitated. Then he unzipped the canvas case and held it out. The rifle was clean. It had been cleaned the way a Marine cleans a rifle, with the attention of a man for whom cleanliness is a value and not merely a habit. The man turned it over in his hands. He looked at the action. He looked at the barrel. He looked at the stock, where there was a small nick near the heel that was the kind of mark a rifle picks up in field conditions and that nobody bothers to repair because it is part of what the rifle is. He said, "This was carried." Danny said it had been. He said, "Korea." Danny said, "Chosin." He was quiet for a moment. He held the rifle the way a man holds a thing he is reading rather than inspecting. He said, "I've been looking for a rifle exactly like this for 3 years. He turned it over again. "We're doing a picture. Marine picture. The kind that gets the details right, which means the props have to be right, which means I need a Springfield that was actually in the field, not a wall display piece." He looked at Danny. "I'd like to buy this rifle." Danny said, "The pawn shop will give me $45 for it." He said, "I know what a pawn shop will give you for it." He set it carefully back in the canvas case. "I'm not a pawn shop." He looked at Danny. $800. That is what I'm prepared to pay for a 1903 Springfield that was carried by a 1st Marine Division corporal at the Chosin Reservoir. He paused. "You'd be doing me a favor. I have been trying to find this rifle for 3 years. Danny Garrett has not moved. He is standing outside a pawn shop on Main Street in Yuma, with his rifle in his hands and a number in the air between him and a stranger, and the number is $800. And he is looking at the man the way a man looks at something he cannot yet believe is real." He said, "That rifle is worth $45. He said, "To a pawn shop, yes, to a picture that is trying to get the 1st Marine Division right, it is worth considerably more." He took out his wallet. He counted 8 bills and set them on the canvas case. "I'll need a written bill of sale, date, description, and your name. Nothing formal. Just something I can put in the prop file." Danny Garrett wrote the bill of sale on the back of a receipt from the hardware store 2 doors down, because that was what he had in his pocket. His name, the rifle description, the date, the price. The man read it and folded it and put it in his shirt pocket. He said, "Corporal Garrett, thank you for your service." He picked up the rifle case. "And thank you for the rifle." He walked back across Main Street toward the surplus store and did not turn around. Danny stood on the sidewalk for a moment with $800 in his hand. Then he walked home. He paid the 4 months of back rent that afternoon. He paid it in full, which was $260, and he had $540 left, which was enough to carry the family through December and January while Bauer's hours situation sorted itself out. By February, Bauer had brought everyone back to 5 days. Danny had not sold anything else. He had not needed to. He paid himself back for the rifle too, in his mind the only way a man can, by staying. He went back to the garage and he worked it for 9 more years. And he was good at his work, and Bauer knew it and said so. And the hours never got cut to 3 days a week again. In 1963, he took a position at the Yuma Proving Ground as a civilian motor pool mechanic, which paid more steadily than a private garage, and which had a benefit structure that covered the girl's doctor visits in a way the garage job never had. He worked the Proving Ground until 1981, when he retired at the age of 50. Carol kept the dress shop job through 1965, and then went full-time when the owner retired and left her the management. Ruth went to Arizona State in 1972. Celia followed in 1975. Both of them came back to Yuma. Danny and Carol had 4 grandchildren, all of them raised within 20 miles of the Colorado River crossing, where Danny had stood outside a pawn shop on a November Tuesday in 1959 with a rifle he could not make himself sell. Think about what $800 on a Yuma sidewalk in November of 1959 became. The back rent paid. The family carried through to the spring. Danny worked 38 more years after that Tuesday. 9 at the garage, 18 at the Proving Ground, and 11 years of retirement before he died in 1992. 2 daughters educated. 4 grandchildren raised near the place where the family had almost slipped. The rifle that was worth $45 at the pawn shop was worth $800 to the right man for the right reason. And that difference, $755 in excess of what the market would have paid, was the full distance between a family that made it through and a family that didn't. The bill of sale Danny Garrett wrote on a hardware store receipt is in a frame on the wall of Ruth's house in Yuma, the one Ruth built in 1984 on the east side of town, where the new developments were going up. It is a plain wood frame, and the paper inside it is a hardware store receipt with Danny's handwriting on the back. 1903 Springfield rifle, carried 1st Marine Div. Chosin Reservoir, Korea. 1950-51. Sold November 1959. Yuma, AZ. Price $800. Cents. Danny Garrett, Corporal USMC. Ruth had it framed after Danny died. The receipt is still legible because Danny's handwriting was clean and the paper was good quality. The afternoon light from Ruth's east window comes across the frame every morning when the sun is right and holds on the paper for about 20 minutes before moving on. The paper is the color of old cream. If you find yourself in Yuma, Ruth lives on the east side, not far from the proving ground. The frame is on the wall in the front room, east of the door. The receipt is still readable. The rifle was carried at the Chosin Reservoir, and the man who bought it knew what that meant. Some of you served. Some of you came home from places like the Chosin Reservoir and spent the years after trying to hold everything together with no one watching and no one paying particular attention. Some of you know a man like Danny Garrett. This story is for all of them. John Wayne never told anyone, not the rifle or the bill of sale or the sidewalk on Main Street. Not the $800 or the canvas case or the nick in the stock near the heel. He finished his work in Yuma and drove north toward Phoenix and said nothing to the people he traveled with about a Marine on a pawnshop sidewalk. There is no letter. There is no record. What is known is what Danny told Carol that evening when he came home with $800 and no rifle, and what Carol told Ruth before she died, and what Ruth wrote in the card she sent to the Veterans Memorial in Yuma in 1993 when they were collecting stories about local veterans for a commemorative display. My father served at Chosin with the 7th Regiment, 1st Marine Division. He came home with a rifle and kept it for 8 years and almost sold it once, and a man on a sidewalk stopped him and paid him what it was worth, and my father always said he knew who it was, and he never told me, and I have always thought that was the right answer. A man crossed a street in Yuma and asked to see a rifle and held it the way a man holds a thing he is reading, and said he had been looking for it for 3 years, and counted $800 onto the canvas case, and took the bill of sale and walked back across the street and did not turn around. He did not look back. He lifted one hand going around the corner. Easy, loose, the way a man raises a hand to answer a question he already knows the answer to. And then he was gone. That is most of how it ever got out at all. If this story meant something to you, subscribe. There is another one like it every week. And unfortunately, they don't make men like John Wayne anymore.